The mansion of Leandro Rossi was not a home. It was a fortress of silence and shadow, a place where whispers clung to the velvet curtains and fear was swept under the priceless Persian rugs. It was a kingdom, and he was its untouchable king. He moved through the grand hallways with a quiet, powerful grace, a storm contained in the form of a man. His voice, when he used it, was a low command that did not ask but told. His eyes, a dark and piercing brown, saw everything. The balance sheets, the rival's weakness, the loyal soldier's fear. They saw everything. That is, except for her. Beatrice was the ghost in his machine. For a year, she had moved through the colossal rooms of his estate, a silent, steady current in the background of his chaotic life. She was the one who ensured his favorite espresso cup was warmed before it was filled. She was the reason the pages of the books in his library were never dusty and the fresh flowers in the foyer never wilted. She learned the rhythms of the house, the times he was in his office, the times he was away on brutal business, the times he had tense, quiet meetings with grim-faced men in suits. She learned these things not out of curiosity, but for survival. To be unseen was to be safe. To be noticed by a man like Leandro Rossi was a dangerous thing. Her day began before the sun painted the city skyline. While the rest of the household guards and staff slept, Beatrice was already in the vast kitchen, the quiet click of the coffee pot a familiar sound in the pre-dawn hush. She worked with an efficient silence, her hands smoothing tablecloths, her feather duster gliding over picture frames, holding photos of people she did not know. She existed in the spaces between his life, a figure of no more consequence than a well-placed chair. Leandro's day started later, with a sudden and imposing energy that shifted the very air in the house. His heavy footsteps on the marble floor signaled his presence long before he entered a room. Beatrice would often be in the study, carefully rearranging documents on his desk into neat piles, when he would stride in. He would not glance at her. He would simply sit, his focus absolute, and begin his work. She would finish her task and slip from the room, and he would not register her leaving any more than he would notice the sun moving across the floor. She was the wallpaper. She was the clock ticking on the wall. She was invisible. This was the unspoken agreement between them, the dance they performed every single day. He was the master of the house, and she was a part of its machinery. It was a simple, clean arrangement, and for a long time, it worked. Beatrice had her own small life beyond these stone walls, her own dreams and worries that she tucked away when she passed through the security gate each morning. Here she was just Beatrice, the quiet helper. It was a role she had perfected. The first thread of this agreement began to unravel on a Tuesday. It was an ordinary morning, the sky outside the large kitchen windows a soft, pale gray. Beatrice had been up late the night before, troubled by a personal matter that had stolen her sleep. The tiredness weighed on her, making her movements just a little slower than usual as she wiped down the already spotless countertops. A young guard named Marco, who often worked the morning shift at the kitchen entrance, noticed. He was new, still friendly, and not yet hardened by the constant grimness of his job. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice a gentle intrusion into the silence. Beatrice offered a small, tired smile. "A little. It's nothing." "Looks like more than nothing," Marco said. He moved to the coffee machine, poured a fresh mug, and added a spoonful of sugar, the way he had seen her take it once before. He slid it across the counter towards her. "Here, this might help." It was a simple act of kindness, a tiny spark of human connection in the cold, formal house. Beatrice felt a genuine warmth spread through her. "Thank you, Marco. That's very sweet." They stood there for a moment, leaning against opposite sides of the large kitchen island. They talked about nothing important, the dreary weather, a new movie, a funny story about Marco's dog. For a few brief minutes, Beatrice forgot where she was. She laughed, a soft, real sound that she usually kept locked away inside her. In that moment, she wasn't the invisible girl. She was just Beatrice, having a coffee with a friendly person. It was at that exact moment that Leandro Rossi walked past the kitchen's arched doorway. He was on his way to his office, a stack of reports in his hand, his mind already calculating the day's moves. The sound of laughter, a woman's laughter, made him pause. It was a sound so foreign in his mausoleum of a home that it snagged his attention like a hook. He turned his head and looked inside. He saw Marco, one of his guards, grinning, and he saw her, the quiet one, the helper. She was smiling, her face transformed by the expression, her eyes bright. She was holding a mug of coffee, looking more relaxed and alive than he had ever seen her. And she was looking at another man, a sensation, hot and sharp and entirely unfamiliar, twisted in Leandro's gut. It was a raw, primal spike of irritation. It was not a calculated thought. It was a pure, visceral reaction. What is he doing? Why is he here? Why is she looking at him like that? The thoughts came unbidden, crashing into his ordered mind. This was his space. Everything in it was his. The guard was on his time, in his kitchen, talking to his employee. The feeling was possessive, irrational, and overwhelmingly strong. He stood there for a full 10 seconds, a statue of simmering anger in the hallway, watching a scene he had no logical reason to care about. He saw the way Marco leaned in, too familiar. He saw the easy smile on Beatrice's face, a smile he had never witnessed, a smile that was not meant for him. The hot feeling in his stomach flared into a cold, hard knot. His feet carried him into the kitchen before his mind could catch up. The atmosphere in the room froze instantly. Marco's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure terror. He snapped to attention, his back rigid, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. "Sir," he stammered. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. The warm, happy feeling from moments before evaporated, replaced by an icy dread. Leandro's presence filled the large room, making it feel small and suffocating. He was even more imposing up close. He radiated a power that was almost physical. He didn't look at Marco. His dark, intense gaze was locked entirely on her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He was looking at her, really looking at her, for the very first time. He noticed things, the slight parting of her lips in surprise, the delicate shape of her face, the intelligent, wary light in her eyes that were not just brown, but held flecks of gold. She was not just a helper. She was a person, a beautiful one. The realization only made the strange jealousy burn brighter. His voice, when it finally came, was low and quiet, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "You!" Beatrice felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She could only nod, her voice trapped somewhere deep inside her. Leandro took a single step closer. "What is your name?" The question was so simple, yet it felt monumental. After a year, he was asking for her name. It was the end of her invisibility. She swallowed, her mouth dry. "Beatrice," she whispered. He held her gaze for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, a storm brewing behind his dark eyes. He absorbed the name, the sound of it. Beatrice. Then, without another word, without even a glance at the terrified guard, he turned and walked out of the kitchen. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed in the silence he left behind. Beatrice stood frozen, the forgotten coffee mug cold in her hands. Marco let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping in relief, but his face was pale. He had narrowly escaped something, though he wasn't sure what. But Beatrice knew. The world had just shifted on its axis. The king had looked down and seen the ghost, and nothing would ever be the same again. The walls of her safe, invisible world had just crumbled to dust. The silence that settled over the mansion after Leandro's departure from the kitchen was of a new and different kind. Before, the silence had been empty, a simple absence of noise. Now it was a charged and waiting thing, thick with unspoken questions and the echo of a single, softly spoken name. Beatrice. For her, the familiar halls of the estate no longer felt like a sanctuary of obscurity. Every shadow seemed to hold his gaze. Every quiet corner felt like a place he had just vacated. She was hyper-aware of her own presence, of the sound of her footsteps on the marble, the rustle of her clothing. The cloak of invisibility had been torn away, and she felt exposed, her skin prickling with a nervous energy she could not quell. She tried to retreat, to shrink back into the background, but it was as if a spell had been broken. The very next morning, as she was quietly polishing the banister of the grand staircase, she felt a shift in the air, a pressure change that announced his arrival. Leandro descended the stairs, his focus seemingly on the phone held to his ear, his voice giving terse, clipped orders. But as he passed her on the steps, his head turned. Just slightly. His eyes for a fleeting second swept over her, from the top of her head down to her hands clutching the polishing cloth, and back up again. It wasn't a glance. It was an assessment, a cataloging. He continued walking without breaking his conversation, but the damage was done. A flush of heat climbed up Beatrice's neck. He had seen her, intentionally. This pattern repeated itself over the following days. Where before his eyes would slide over her as if she were made of glass, now they would pause, linger, and note her presence. He would be in his study, and she would enter to water the plants. He would stop talking, mid-sentence, and watch her cross the room. She would feel the weight of his stare between her shoulder blades, a physical sensation that made her hands tremble. He never spoke to her, never acknowledged these moments beyond the act of looking itself. It was a silent, unnerving game of observation, and Beatrice was entirely out of her depth. She didn't understand the rules or the objective. She only knew that the king of this fortress was watching her, and she had no idea why. The fragile, terrifying new routine was shattered a week later. It was late afternoon, and Beatrice was in the library, tasked with reshelving a collection of leather-bound ledgers that had been left on a central table. The task was heavy, and one of the larger books slipped from her grasp, thudding loudly onto the Persian rug. At that exact moment, Marco, having just come off his patrol shift and looking for a moment's quiet, happened to be walking past the open library doors. Hearing the sound, he peeked in. "Need a hand with those, Beatrice?" he asked, his voice friendly, though his eyes still held a trace of wariness from the kitchen incident. Before she could even answer, he was at her side, easily hefting two of the heaviest ledgers. "Just point me to where they go," he said with a small, reassuring smile, trying to bridge the awkwardness that had grown between them. Beatrice, flustered, managed a grateful nod. "Over on that top shelf, thank you, Marco." She reached up to guide him, her fingers brushing against the spine of a book to indicate the spot. It was an innocent, collaborative moment. It was also the moment Leandro chose to walk by. He stopped in the doorway. He saw Marco standing close to her, his body angled towards hers, a ledger in his hands. He saw Beatrice looking up at the guard, her expression one of relieved thanks. And he saw red. The cold, simmering possessiveness that had taken root in his chest days before erupted into a blazing, uncontrollable fire. This was not a fleeting, curious glance. This was a direct challenge. This guard, this boy, was in his space, touching his things, talking to his Beatrice. The thought slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. His, the word echoed in his mind, primal and absolute. He moved into the room with a predator's silence, his presence expanding to fill every inch of it. The air grew cold. Marco, sensing the shift before he even saw it, froze. The ledger held precariously in his stiffening arms. His face drained of all color as he turned and met his boss's eyes. It was the look of a man staring into his own grave. Leandro's gaze was not on Marco. It was fixed on Beatrice, who had taken a startled step back, her hand flying to her throat. His expression was granite, his jaw a hard, tight line. Then with a deliberate, possessive finality, he closed the distance between them. He did not look at Marco. He only looked at her as he raised his arm and draped it around Beatrice's shoulders, pulling her firmly against his side. The contact was electric, shocking. His body was solid and warm, his grip unyielding. It was not a gentle embrace. It was a claim, a brand. He finally turned his deadly calm gaze onto the petrified guard. "You are fired," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "for bothering my staff. Get out of my house. If I see you again, you will regret it." Marco didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply nodded. A quick, jerky motion of pure terror, placed the ledger on the table with trembling hands, and all but fled from the room, from the house, from their lives. The moment he was gone, Leandro's arm dropped from Beatrice's shoulders as if she had burned him. The space where his body had been felt instantly, shockingly cold. She stood there trembling, a storm of emotions warring inside her. Fear, shock, and a rising hot wave of anger. "How could you do that?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a fury that overpowered her fear. "He was helping me. He was just being kind. You had no right." Leandro turned to face her fully, and for the first time she saw a crack in his impenetrable facade. He looked unsettled, as if his own actions had surprised even him. Her defiance, her anger, was a language no one had ever dared to speak to him. It was not the reaction he had expected. "Kindness is a liability in this world," he replied, his voice rough. "It gets people killed. I will not have my staff distracted." "This isn't about distraction," Beatrice shot back, her courage fueled by indignation. "This was cruel, and it was wrong." He studied her then, truly studied her, as if seeing a new person standing where the quiet helper had been just moments before. He saw the fire in her golden-flecked eyes, the proud set of her jaw, the way her small hands were clenched into fists at her sides. She was not cowering. She was standing up to him. The realization was a jolt to his system, more intriguing and disarming than any threat from a rival family. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. The anger slowly seeped out of Beatrice, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion and a deep, unsettling confusion. What was happening? Finally, Leandro spoke. His tone changed. It was still a command, but it was quieter, more deliberate. "Your old duties are finished. Effective immediately, you are my personal assistant. You will report to my office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Your first task will be to reorganize the filing system. It's inefficient." The order was so sudden, so absurdly domestic after the scene that had just transpired, that Beatrice could only stare at him. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't explaining. He was simply pulling her deeper into his orbit, closing the distance he had once maintained. He was making it impossible for her to be invisible ever again. Without waiting for her agreement, which he clearly did not need, he turned and left the library, leaving her alone amidst the silent books, the scent of his cologne still clinging to her clothes, and the terrifying, thrilling understanding that her life had just been irrevocably tethered to his. The game was over. A new one, with rules she could not possibly foresee, had just begun. The title of personal assistant was a flimsy veil for the reality of Beatrice's new existence. It was not about filing or scheduling, though there was plenty of that. It was about proximity. Leandro had drawn a circle around himself and pulled her inside it. Her world shrank to the dimensions of his orbit. She now occupied a small, elegant desk just outside his private office, a space that felt both like a position of privilege and a gilded cage. The other staff members treated her with a new, cautious distance, their greetings polite but their eyes full of unasked questions. She was no longer one of them. She was his. Their days fell into a new, intense rhythm. He was a demanding, exacting boss, his standards impossibly high. He expected her to anticipate his needs, to understand the complex, shadowy workings of his business without him having to explain. He would hand her a coded message and expect it deciphered. He would mention a rival's name and expect a dossier on her desk within the hour. It was exhausting, terrifying, and to her own surprise, deeply stimulating. Beatrice discovered a sharp, strategic mind within herself she never knew she possessed. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, the tightening of his jaw that meant a deal was souring, the slight relaxation of his shoulders that signaled a victory. The forced closeness did what proximity always does. It eroded the walls of mystery and built bridges of understanding. During late nights when the mansion was silent and the city lights glittered beyond the office windows, the strict boundary between boss and employee would sometimes blur. He would ask her opinion on a business matter, not as a test, but with genuine curiosity. She, in turn, began to see past the feared mafia boss to the man beneath, a man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders, a man who trusted no one, a man who was profoundly, achingly lonely. She saw the weariness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, the slight softening of his expression when she brought him a fresh cup of coffee without being asked. Leandro, for his part, was unraveling. The quiet, invisible girl was a mirage. In her place was a woman of startling intelligence and quiet strength. He found himself watching the way she bit her lip in concentration, the graceful movement of her hands as she sorted documents, the surprising wit in her observations. The possessive jealousy he had felt was now tangled with something deeper, more dangerous, and infinitely more terrifying. A profound, disarming respect. And something else, a feeling that warmed the cold, empty chambers of his heart. He was falling in love with her. The realization was a catastrophe. In his world, love was not a blessing, it was a target. It was the ultimate vulnerability, a weapon his enemies would not hesitate to use. This truth crystallized one evening after a particularly tense phone call. He hung up, his face a mask of cold fury. He stood by the window, his back to her, his hands clenched into fists. "You should go," he said, his voice rough. "You should leave this city. I will give you enough money to start over anywhere you want." Beatrice, who had been gathering her things to leave for the night, stopped. "What? Why?" He turned, and the raw conflict in his eyes stole her breath. "Because you make me weak, Beatrice," he confessed, the words torn from him. "When I think of you, I cannot think clearly. When I worry for you, I cannot act decisively. You have become a liability to my judgment." It was the cruelest thing he could have said, wrapped in the most honest admission he had ever made. Instead of crumbling, Beatrice walked toward him. She stood before him, her head held high, refusing to be reduced to a weakness. "You're wrong, Leandro," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Love doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong. It gives you a reason to fight that is bigger than power or money. It gives you something real to protect." She took a final brave step, closing the distance between them. "I'm not leaving, because I have fallen in love with you too." The admission hung in the air between them, a defiant, beautiful truth. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his defenses shattering. Then, with a low, guttural sound, he closed the distance and captured her lips with his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claiming, a release, a confession. It was a year of ignored glances and weeks of simmering tension exploding into a single perfect moment. It was the world falling away, leaving only the two of them, bound by a truth too powerful to deny. But their world was not one that allowed for perfect moments. Leandro's enemies, the Volkov family, had been watching. They had seen the way the untouchable Leandro Rossi now looked at his assistant. They had seen the way he positioned his body to shield hers, the way his eyes tracked her across a room. They had found the king's weakness, and they moved to strike. Days later, Leandro was driving Beatrice home, a new unspoken intimacy between them. His hand rested on her knee, his thumb tracing slow circles. It was on a dark, secluded stretch of road that the attack came. Headlights, blindingly bright, flared in the rearview mirror. Another car swerved in front of them, slamming its brakes. Tires screeched. Metal screamed as Leandro's car was boxed in and rammed. "Get down!" Leandro roared, shoving Beatrice's head down as glass exploded from a gunshot. What followed was a violent, chaotic ballet of survival. Leandro moved with a terrifying, brutal efficiency. He was no longer the man who had kissed her so desperately. He was a weapon, a force of nature. He shoved her out her door and onto the pavement, using the car as a shield. He returned fire, his aim precise and deadly. Beatrice crouched behind the wreckage, her heart pounding in her throat, watching him fight not for money or territory, but for her. He took down one attacker, then another, his movements a blur of controlled violence. He was a storm, a protector, a man fueled by a love he had just confessed. In that moment of terror, he was more powerful than he had ever been. When the last shot echoed into silence, the air smelled of gunpowder and blood. Leandro stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his knuckles bleeding, a cut on his forehead dripping crimson. He turned, his eyes wild, scanning the darkness until they found her. He stumbled toward her, his composure completely gone. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands cupping her face, checking her for injuries. "Beatrice," he breathed, his voice ragged with fear and adrenaline. "Are you hurt? Tell me you're not hurt." "I'm okay," she whispered, her own hands trembling as they came up to cover his. "I'm okay. Because of you." He pulled her into a fierce, crushing embrace. holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning world. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming force of his emotion. When he pulled back, his dark eyes glistening with unshed tears, locked with hers. "I love you, Beatrice," he said, the words clear and strong, a vow made in the aftermath of a battle. "You were invisible until you walked into my heart and refused to leave. I lost all control because the thought of a world without you in it is a world I do not want to live in. I was a king in an empty castle until you brought me to life." It was the final surrender. The Mafia boss had not just fallen in love, he had been redeemed by it. In the weeks that followed, Leandro Rossi did not hide his love. He proclaimed it. He made Beatrice his partner in every sense of the word. She sat beside him in meetings, her calm intelligence balancing his fierce will. The mansion was no longer a fortress of silence, but a home filled with a quiet, powerful love. He was still a powerful, dangerous man, but now he was a man with a soul, with a heart, with a reason to build a future rather than just defend an empire. They ruled their complicated, dangerous world together, their love a legendary strength that their enemies now feared more than any weapon. The invisible girl had become the queen, and the king finally was whole. The story of Leandro and Beatrice may have reached its happy ending, but a world of dark romance, fierce passion, and thrilling danger awaits. If you crave more tales of brooding bosses and the strong women who tame their hearts, your next obsession is just a click away. Subscribe now and never miss a story.